There's a really specific moment in the hospital that I think most of us just completely take for granted.
Oh, yeah, the paperwork moment.
Right, exactly. The chaos of the birth is finally over. Everyone is just completely exhausted. And then a nurse or a clerk hands you this form.
The birth certificate.
Yeah. And there's that one line for the surname. And for the vast majority of us, filling in that blank isn't really a decision. It's a reflex.
A reflex, yeah.
You just write the father's last name. It feels less like a conscious choice and more like a law of nature almost.
It really does feel that way. It is one of the strongest social scripts we have. But, strictly speaking, in the United States, there's absolutely no law mandating it.
Right.
It's purely custom, and yet it's the default setting for millions of families.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today for you. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating new study. It's titled Still the Father's Name: Normative Change and Continuity in Children's Surnames.
Yeah, by Florencia Torche, Tessa Holtzman, and Tyler McDaniel.
Yes, published just this year in Social Science Research. And the mission for this deep dive is to answer a question that, well, it seems simple on the surface, but it's actually incredibly complex. In an era of what sociologists call the gender revolution, where women are the breadwinners, they're CEOs, they're keeping their own names at marriage, is the practice of giving children the father's name finally dying out?
And to answer that, we aren't just looking at a small opinion poll of a couple hundred people. The data set here is massive.
It's huge.
The researchers analyzed the entire universe of birth records from New Jersey between the years 2000 and 2021.
Wow.
That is over 2 million births.
2 million is a serious sample size.
Yeah.
But I do have to ask, and I'm sure you're wondering this too, why New Jersey? Is the Garden State really the best mirror for the whole country?
Surprisingly, yes, it is.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the researchers make a very strong case for it. While New Jersey does lean a little more liberal politically, its demographic makeup is kind of perfect. Well, the mix of urban and suburban areas, the racial diversity, the socioeconomic spread, it's a very good proxy for the United States as a whole.
Okay, that makes sense.
So when we see a trend in the New Jersey birth records, we can be pretty confident it's reflecting a broader national reality.
Got it. Okay, so let's look at the headline trend, because if I were betting, just going off my gut, I'd say the father's name tradition is definitely slipping.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're 20 years into the 21st century. Surely fewer kids are getting just the dad's name today than they were in 2000.
Well, you would win that bet, but only just barely.
Oh.
Yeah. In 2000, about 87 to 88% of children received the father's surname. By 2021, that number had dropped to roughly 80 or 81%.
Okay, so a 7-point drop.
Exactly.
That's not nothing. That is nearly 1 in 5 kids not carrying the patrilineal name.
Right.
And my instinct is to just say, well, there it is. That's the gender revolution at work.
It seems obvious.
Women are asserting equality in the public sphere, in the workplace. So naturally, they're asserting it on the birth certificate too.
That is the logical assumption. The researchers actually call that hypothesis A.
Okay.
But here's where the deep dive gets really interesting. The data actually completely rejects that hypothesis.
It rejects it. Wait, so the drop isn't because of gender equality?
Not in the way you might think. To explain this, the researchers introduce a counter-concept called cultural lag.
Cultural lag. Okay, let's unpack that. It sounds like a disconnect between what we say as a society and what we actually do.
Precisely. The theory is that changes in the public sphere, like the workplace, higher education, politics, those happen much faster than changes in the private sphere.
Where private sphere being the family.
Exactly. The home, marriage, naming conventions. In fact, sometimes when gender roles are challenged in public, people actually cling to traditional symbols in private to compensate.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
It's a way of saying, the world out there is changing, it's chaotic, but our family structure right here is solid.
That makes a lot of psychological sense, actually. It's a symbolic defense. Like, I might make more money than my husband, but I'll give the kid his name just to, keep the peace and maintain the traditional image.
Exactly. It upholds what they call the symbolic gender order. And the study proves this by breaking the data down by where the parents were born.
Right. This is the part of the paper that really got me.
This is the single most shocking finding in the entire study.
Yeah, I was looking at this chart and my jaw just hit the floor. Break it down for the listener.
Okay, so they separated the 2 million birth records into 3 groups. 2 U.S.-born parents, 2 foreign-born parents, and mixed couples.
Right.
Now, if the gender revolution were driving this change, you would expect U.S.-born parents, who are arguably the most modern, the most exposed to American feminist discourse to be leading the charge away from the father's name.
Of course.
Hmm.
They should be the ones hyphenating or just giving the kid the mother's name.
But they aren't. Not at all.
Tell them the numbers.
Yeah. In 2000, 97% of U.S.-born parents gave the child the father's name. In 2021, it was still 96%.
That is statistically flat.
Yeah.
It hasn't budged in 2 decades.
It is remarkably stable. The group that is the most embedded in American culture is actually the most resistant to changing the naming norm.
That is wild to me. 96% is basically universal compliance. It's a monolith.
It really is.
So if the Americans aren't changing their habits, that 7% national drop has to be coming from somewhere else entirely.
It's coming from immigrant families, almost entirely.
Wow.
When the researchers looked at children with 2 foreign-born parents, the rate of giving the father's name went from 85% in 2000 all the way down to 56% in 2021.
56%. That is a total collapse.
A massive drop.
So the real headline here isn't that Americans are abandoning tradition. It's that immigrants are changing the mathematical average.
Exactly. And the mixed couples actually prove this point beautifully. If you have a couple with 1 U.S.-born parent and 1 immigrant parent, their naming numbers sit right in the middle, but they lean heavily toward the U.S. norm.
Interesting.
It suggests that assimilation in America actually means adopting the father's name tradition.
That is incredibly ironic. I mean, we usually think of assimilation as quote-unquote modernizing, but in this specific case, becoming American means adopting a very rigid patriarchal naming custom.
It really flips the script on the whole modernization theory.
It does. But we need to dig into why the foreign-born parents are abandoning the father's name in the first place.
Right.
Because are we seeing a massive influx of feminist immigrants who are actively rejecting the patriarchy? Or is there something else at play in the data?
So the researchers did what's called a decomposition analysis to figure this out.
Meaning they looked under the hood of the demographic changes.
Exactly. They wanted to see if the drop was just because there are simply more immigrants now with different habits, or if the behavior within the immigrant community itself is changing over time.
And it turns out it's a behavioral change, specifically among Hispanic immigrants.
Correct. This is what we can call the Hispanic paradox in this data.
I love that term.
You see the overall numbers drop, and you naturally think, oh, they aren't using the father's name anymore. But actually, they aren't inventing some new feminist egalitarian system.
Right.
They are simply reverting to the naming conventions of their countries of origin, specifically Spain and Latin America.
With a double surname. A lot of my friends from Colombia and Mexico have this. It's the father's last name plus the mother's last name.
Exactly. But the key detail here is the order of the names.
Right, right.
In the traditional Spanish convention, the father's surname is actually listed first.
First.
Yes, it is the primary identifier. The mother's name comes second.
Ah, okay. So in the New Jersey database, if a kid gets a double name, it gets coded by the researchers as, quote-unquote, not the father's name.
Right, because the full string of text doesn't match the dad's name exactly.
Because it has that extra name tacked on the end. But socially, culturally, the father's name is still leading the charge. It's still front and center.
That's the crucial nuance here. In 2000, only about 17% of Hispanic foreign-born parents use this combined format.
So they were trying to assimilate.
Yes, they were mostly conforming to the U.S. single name style. But by 2021, 56% were using the combined format.
So they basically stopped trying to fit into the American box and just went back to their roots.
Yes. And the researchers argue that this isn't a decline in patrilineal naming at all.
It's not a feminist victory in the data.
No, it's just a shift from one patriarchal tradition, the U.S. style, to another patriarchal tradition, the Latin American style. The father is still the head of the name, just in a slightly different format.
So the gender revolution isn't driving the immigrant numbers either. It's just cultural retention.
Exactly. It's about heritage, not necessarily gender equality.
Okay, so let's pivot to the other really big driver in this study, which is socioeconomic status, because this is where that cultural lag theory really gets put to the test.
Oh, absolutely.
If I were guessing, I would assume that highly educated, wealthy parents, the ones who have the most economic freedom, the most exposure to progressive ideas, they would be the ones breaking the norm.
That is the standard expectation in sociology. The idea that high status leads to more egalitarian, modern values.
Right.
But the data shows the exact opposite.
The complete opposite.
The complete opposite. Mothers with high levels of education, meaning a bachelor's degree or more, are actually offsetting the national decline.
You're kidding.
No. They have maintained the father's name tradition more strictly over the last 2 decades than almost anyone else in the data set.
So the people who could theoretically afford to buck the trend, the ones writing the feminist theory, are the ones holding on to the patriarchal naming convention the tightest.
Yes. The actual erosion of the norm is happening among mothers with lower levels of education, high school or less,
What?
especially among cohabiting parents. For low-education mothers who are living with their partner but aren't married, there was a steep decline in giving the father's name. It dropped from 83% down to 62%.
This feels like a massive class divide. Why are working class or less educated families abandoning the tradition while the wealthy cling to it?
The researchers connect this to a sociological concept called divergent destinies.
Divergent destinies.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds a bit ominous, honestly. What does it mean in this context?
It refers to how family structures in America are essentially splitting along class lines.
Okay.
For highly educated upper-middle-class Americans, the traditional family bundle, meaning marriage, economic stability, and standard naming conventions, has basically become a status symbol.
Ah, so having the matching last names is like having the white picket fence.
Precisely. It signals to the world, we made it, we are stable, we follow the rules of success.
It's part of the script of the successful upper-class life.
Exactly. It's a marker of legitimacy. Meanwhile, for less educated families, that traditional script is breaking down. Marriage rates are lower in that demographic, and economic instability is much higher.
Right. The reality of their lives doesn't match that 1950s ideal anymore.
Right. And as the tie between the father and the family unit loosens due to that instability, the naming convention just follows suit.
So it's not that these working-class mothers are necessarily ideologically opposed to the father's name. It's that the institution that traditionally supports the name, the stable, lifelong marriage, just isn't there for them.
That's the core of it. If you aren't sure if the father's going to stick around, or if you just aren't engaging with the institution of marriage at all, the social pressure to use his name kind of evaporates.
Which leads us perfectly into the union status puzzle from the study. Because they looked very closely at married parents versus unmarried parents.
I did.
And there was one specific data point that really stood out to me as a total anomaly.
You're thinking of the non-cohabiting parents?
Yes, exactly. So just to lay it out for you, we have married parents, and they have the highest usage of the dad's name.
Almost universal.
Right. Then we have cohabiting parents, meaning they live together but aren't married, and they have the lowest usage. But then you have unmarried parents who do not live together at all.
Right. These are often the most fragile relationships in the data set.
Logically, you would think the mother in that situation is raising the baby, she's living alone or with her own family. The dad isn't even in the house.
She should be the most likely to give the child her own name.
Exactly. Why name the kid after a guy who isn't even your roommate?
But the data shows that this specific group has remained completely stable or even slightly increased their use of the father's name since the early 2000s.
It makes no sense.
In recent years, they are actually more likely to use the father's name than the couple who are romantically involved and living together.
That seems completely counterintuitive, unless there's some kind of strategy involved here.
That is exactly what the researchers call it, strategic naming.
Okay, unpack strategic naming for us. How does that work?
Think about the position of a vulnerable single mother who isn't living with the father of her child. She needs support. Financial support, emotional support, social support.
Right. She's in a precarious position.
The researchers argued that giving the child the father's name in that scenario is a claim. It is a way to symbolically bind the father to the child.
Wow. So it's a tether.
Yes.
It's a way of saying, look, here's your name. This is your son or your daughter. You have an obligation here.
Exactly. It's a signal of hope, or almost a social contract.
That is so powerful.
Whereas the cohabiting couple, the ones who are actually living together, they might be actively rejecting the institution of marriage. And by extension, they're rejecting the naming norms.
Right. They're saying, we're committed, but we don't need the piece of paper from the government, and we don't need the patriarchal name to prove it.
But the single mother living apart isn't rejecting the institution at all. She's often trying to anchor herself to it, just for pure survival.
It really highlights how names are a kind of currency.
Oh, absolutely.
For the rich and educated, it's a currency of status and respectability. But for the vulnerable, It's a currency of obligation and survival.
That's a great way to put it.
It adds such a heavy human layer to all these spreadsheets and statistics. We aren't just looking at data points, we're looking at people trying to secure a future for their kids.
It really grounds the research in reality.
Now, there is one more variable we have to touch on before we wrap up, and it's the one that makes me sigh just a little bit.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
The gender of the baby.
Yeah.
We are deep in the 21st century. Please tell me we don't still have a preference for naming sons after dads more than daughters.
I really wish I could tell you that I do. But the study found a very persistent son preference.
Of course we do. The whole male heir syndrome.
It's subtle in the data, but it is definitively there.
How subtle.
Well, among married couples, there's basically no difference because everyone gets the name anyway. It's what statisticians call a ceiling effect.
Right. If it's at 96%, there's no room for a gap.
Exactly, but among unmarried couples where there is actual negotiation and choice involved, sons are about 1 to 2 percentage points more likely to get the father's name than daughters are.
1 or 2 points sounds small, but in a data set of 2 million births, that's not an accident.
No, it's a statistically significant pattern. It suggests that the patrilineal norm, this ancient idea of passing down the family line through the male, is felt much more strongly when there is actually a son involved.
Especially when the marriage structure isn't there to enforce the naming automatically.
Right. Unmarried parents go out of their way to make sure the boy carries the family name.
No, it's just fascinating how these old habits die hard.
They really do.
So if we zoom out and look at this entire landscape, that Torch and her team have mapped out the cultural lag, the immigrant assimilation, the massive class divide, the strategic naming, what is the final verdict here? Is the father's name dying out?
The answer is really no but. It is eroding at the margins. It's being challenged by immigrants who are reverting to their own traditions, and it's being challenged by lower-income families who are disconnecting from the standard family model entirely.
Right.
But the core, the center of American society, the educated, married, U.S.-born couples.
It's rock solid.
It is entirely unyielding.
It's surprisingly resilient. And it brings us right back to that idea of cultural lag you mentioned earlier. We see all this gender progress in wages and higher education and political representation.
Yes.
But the symbolic gender order of family names is moving at an absolute glacial pace.
It seems that U.S.-born parents might be holding on to this specific tradition precisely because all those other things in the public sphere are changing so fast.
It's the one thing they just won't let go of.
It's their anchor.
It really makes you wonder about the limits of the gender revolution. Because if even the most highly educated, progressive, politically active American parents aren't changing their naming habits, is the father's name the last untouchable stronghold of the traditional family?
It's a highly provocative question. Because as long as the default is the father's name, the symbolic head of the household, at least on paper, to the government and to society, remains the man.
And that symbolism matters.
It matters deeply.
It certainly does. And, you know, there's one more thing to think about with all this, something that data doesn't even touch on yet.
What's that?
Think about all those kids from the immigrant families we talked about, the ones getting the double surnames.
Right, the 56% of Hispanic immigrants.
Exactly. What happens in 20 or 30 years when that entire generation grows up and 2 people with double surnames get married and have a kid?
Oh, wow.
Are we going to see kids with 4 last names? Or will they be forced by sheer logistics to pick just one? And if they have to pick one to pass down, whose name wins? The grandfathers? The grandmothers?
The logistics of that are going to force a massive cultural conversation.
It really will. We might be looking at a completely different naming crisis in a couple of decades. Something to chew on the next time you see a birth announcement pop up on your feed. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this. We will be back next time with another deep dive. See you then.